Good morning, all. Thank you, Chris. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. I take this time to affirm that I live and work in the traditional territory shared by the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. This was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, whose wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the land and one spoon to represent the sharing of resources and taking only what one needs. I recognize also that the people we call the neutral and their ancestors were custodians of this land, and their descendants are included among the Haudenosaunee and other nations. I turn now to the myth of an empty landscape and my attempts to see the Mississaugas at the head of the lake through a wilderness of thick wood. Local Hamilton poet and author John Terpstra has recently recounted two versions of the story of the UEL Hess family arriving at the head of the lake or the Hamilton area in 1788. These were recounted to him by two cousins, both descendants of the farmers of Spring Farm on the West Mountain, where the Hesses settled. In the first version, Michael Hess and his son Peter are described as arriving at Burlington Heights by canoe. They climbed the 30-meter glacial bar that separates Cootes Paradise from Burlington Bay, about where Dundurn Castle now stands. From there, they briefly joined a great east-west ancient foot highway before veering off to the south. The highway that Terpstra refers to appears on a circa 1783 map of the route of Governor's Road. To the south of that route, a second trail cuts to the southwest, across what is now West Hamilton, up through Ancaster, and out by the oxbow of the Grand River to Mohawk Village. Although not mentioned in the story, the Hesses' route up Burlington Heights may have been from Richard Beasley's fur trade complex, sometimes referred to as Beasley Landing. As an undergrad, I was on the 1996 Archaeological Field School there. Instead of continuing on westwards across Shadow Creek and out to the west, though, the Hesses in this story turned south along the creek and followed it up the escarpment. Incidentally, this suggested route would have seen them pass just east of where S.A. McMaster now sits and past what I think was the closest Ancaster church source to Princess Point in the Shadow Creek Gorge. They would have crested the escarpment maybe just west of the Shadow Falls site, probably long since grown over. But backing up a minute, it may have been easier for the Hesses to have paddled around the northern tip of Burlington Heights through the Hendry Valley, past Nursery, Old Lilac Gardens, and Princess Point, as far up Shadow Creek as possible before abandoning their vessel. Regardless, and probably more sensible, Terpstra goes on to point out that a second version of the Hess family arrival story is more likely. That one has them walking in via the Mohawk Trail with other families, ultimately from Pennsylvania. Beasley Landing and Cootes Paradise would be bypassed, and that would be that for my story. Still, I'd like to use that first version of the Hesses' arrival as a jumping off point to introduce my current understanding of landscape history in and around Cootes Paradise and the head of the lake. Terpstra recounts that at the time the Hesses arrived, settlers were moving into what was, for the most part, unoccupied territory. Like the Attawandaron, the settlers had been run out of their homes. They were fleeing into an unsettled wilderness. Following the time of the neutral, Terpstra goes on, the land was depopulated and uninhabited, except by small groups of Mississauga who had drifted in from the east. It remained that way for the next 100 years. Maybe the reason it's so hard to sense a native presence here is because for such a long period of time, there simply wasn't one. Elsewhere, Terpstra notes that the indigenous population was small and that he thinks of the area as a no man's land. I don't really mean to pick on John Terpstra. His work on Shadow Creek and Burlington Heights has very much enlightened me. Several of us as archaeologists, I think, have also been drawn into the myth of an empty landscape. We often fall back on the concept of no man's or nobody's land, the perspective that the Haudenosaunee eradicated the neutral, so who will speak for the Cononton, and a view that the Mississaugas were latecomers filling up a vacuum. Speaking of the Attawandaron or neutral, Rick Montour from McMaster has recently noted that many people at Six Nations believe that the neutral were not an independent nation per se, but were actually Haudenosaunee and Wendat, and probably some Anishinaabe people who chose to live in southern Ontario for various reasons. With changing demographics due to encroachment and epidemics, the neutral were reabsorbed, adopted back into the Haudenosaunee populations, rather than outright warfare that so many theorize. Montour has an additional challenging premise that I've not heard articulated quite like it before. Western scholars have been quick to take up the warrior-like stereotype of the Iroquois as a way to justify our treatment over the years. as a means to feel less guilty about stealing land from indigenous nations that don't exist any longer since they were wiped out by other native peoples. In fact, they certainly do still exist, but are just known as a different group living 45 minutes away. Terpstra grapples with longing to see without quite being able to discern indigenous people's pasts at Burlington Heights, for example. He knows of the field schools at Beasley Landing from the early 90s. He recites parts of Elizabeth Simcoe's diary, but he also states, "Perhaps when I stand on the Iroquois bar and yearn for a native presence, I'm already getting what I ask for. The presence is the place itself." The notion of a place untouched by indigenous people, absent of them, where land doesn't need or simply supersedes indigenous people and indigenous pasts, seems to persist in the popular imagination. This means we as archaeologists have not done enough to give our communities the tools and the evidence to evaluate the myth of a landscape devoid of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Gary Warwick has called the Mississaugas of Davisville archaeologically invisible, but this doesn't mean they went unseen by the settlers of their time. Still, we've been taught to think that the lack of sturdy stone and brick buildings and a light indigenous footprint somehow legitimates late 18th century and contemporary settlers' devouring of the land. What evidence do we have for a peri-1800 Mississauga presence at the head of the lake? Several field schools at Dundurn Castle through the 90s and after provided us, I think, with some of the first archaeological evidence for the Mississaugas in the Burlington Bay area. Stemming from those, John Triggs recounts two main Mississauga components associated with the Beasley complex: a midden dating about 1802 to 1812, and a nearby encampment dating about 1813 to 15. So that's the War of 1812-14 period and its aftermath. The faunal assemblage from the midden points to year-round periodic visits by the Mississaugas in those waning days of the fur trade. When the faunal assemblage from the midden was compared to that of the wartime encampment, though, the later assemblage is much smaller. While broadly similar in species composition, muskrat and coyote are absent. Triggs considers this a signal of a time of greater disruption for the Mississaugas. It's thought that shortly after the war, this community may not have even returned to the head of the lake. In 2006, I started field school investigations at Nursery in Cootes Paradise, mostly to try to find evidence of middle to late woodland transitions and to work on a classic 1969 Southers and Kenyan site. I had little knowledge of Mississauga history and archaeology. Among many other items, we found two cobalt blue tubular glass trade beads that year. And for a long time, I considered those beads to be contact neutral or maybe Seneca. I knew LaSalle had come through the area in 1669 and maybe even made it into Cootes Paradise. And it wasn't until the second half of 2017 that this changed. I believed that those glass trade beads dated within the 1600s. In essence, I thought they stemmed from a Haudenosaunee presence at the site. But in subsequent discussions with several colleagues, it's now believed that they derive from a previously undocumented Mississauga camp at Nursery. In reviewing material from my license and Megan Birchall's work, several other items may be pointed to as possibly deriving from the Mississauga component. In 2006, a pewter King George III cipher military button was recovered, and it's thought to date to the American War of Independence period. Could this item have come from Indigenous allies and not simply British forces? A silver ear bob from 2011 is very similar to the one from the Jack Bellamy site in southwestern Ontario, dating about 1790. A punched lead bale seal from the 2012 field school likely belongs to this period too. And there are some French flint flakes recovered from various years, thought to be gun flint flakes, either from firing flintlock arms or using gun flints as strike-a-lights. French flints were also recovered from Beasley Landing, and English flints are present too. What was initially considered a Kettle Point core fragment in 2018 was reviewed in 2020 and is now thought to be a gun flint, possibly reused as a strike-a-light. And even much of the minute calcined faunal assemblage could be indicative of a Mississauga presence and sounds similar to that recovered from Davisville 3. As this Mississauga component was being recognized, it was an uncanny coincidence that the Indigenous People and Plants Discovery Trail, Anishinaabe Wataziwin, bordering Nursery, was inaugurated in September 2017. Of some note, this RBG walking trail had been known as Captain Cootes Trail. Captain Thomas Coote, a British military officer, was so keen on hunting in the marsh, he seems to have repeatedly come up from Fort Niagara sometime between 1778 and 1788. By at least 1793, the wetland was known as Cootes Paradise. Cootes Paradise then was named for a British military officer who was only visiting, while Wahbanosay's band of the Mississaugas was still at home there. The Mississaugas seem to have known Spencer Creek, the main creek at the western end of Cootes Paradise, as Etobicoke, or Black Alder Creek. Augustus Jones, the surveyor, for example, noted that Etobicoke was the creek near Morden's. I'm not sure if that means near Morden's Point or the Morden's House, but I assume it to be Spencer Creek, and by extension, Cootes Paradise. There are alders that grow down by the boathouse at Nursery, too. In 1796, Elizabeth Simcoe wrote, "The river, which I take to mean Cootes Paradise, and the bay were full of canoes, and it abounds with wildfowl and tortoises. From hence it appears more like a river than a marsh, and Mordaunt's Point in the distance takes a fine shape." In thinking about trails and routes, Terpstra points out that Beasley set himself up on Burlington Heights at a key intersection of existing trails. This was about 1785 or a little before. The new Six Nations community on the Grand River was also linked by trail to this location. In 1793, Elizabeth Simcoe and her husband, Governor Simcoe, left Mohawk Village with Joseph Brant and other Haudenosaunee and traveled to Beasley's. Brant, who had recently led his community to the Grand River from New York, positioned himself at the north end of the Burlington Bar. Jones, at work by 1787, laying out lots and concessions, placed himself near the south end of the Burlington Bar. Along with Beasley, they were sort of the head of the lake triumvirate. If the land was so empty, though, who was maintaining all those trails before 1785? The Mississaugas at the head of the lake are so often ignored in the empty lands myth. Their chief, Wahbanosay, aided Augustus Jones in surveying Yonge Street from York to Lake Simcoe. Jones married in a Mississauga ceremony Wahbanosay's daughter, Tubananiquay, and Tubananiquay, also known as Sarah Henry, was born on Burlington Heights in 1780. Tubananiquay and Jones had at least two sons, Tyantaneged, named after Joseph Brant, and Kahkewaquonaby, sacred feathers. Kahkewaquonaby, born on the Heights in 1802, would come to be known as Reverend Peter Jones, the Methodist minister. Despite such connections between the Mississaugas and some of the settlers, even Peter Jones' stories of his childhood are not that well known. During that 1793 trip from Mohawk Village to Beasley's, Elizabeth Simcoe notes that they came upon a Mississauga camp. That would have been somewhere along the ancient foot highway. A few years later, the Simcoes visited Beasley again and recorded that Burlington Bay was full of canoes. From the Mississauga fishers, the Simcoes bought some fine salmon, which they had for dinner along with tortoise, presumably turtle. In the context of the Mississauga encampment near Beasley's, which Elizabeth Simcoe mentioned in 1793, and immediately after her 1796 diary notes about the numerous canoes in Burlington Bay, it's curious that she can also go on to say, "We walked 2 miles on this park, which is quite natural. There are no settlements near it, and that the country appears more fit for the reception of inhabitants than any part of the province I have seen, being already cleared." But the land already had Mississauga inhabitants in settlements. In fact, instead of the Mississaugas being drawn to Burlington Heights because of Beasley and his goods, Beasley mapped onto the Mississaugas, who may have been there since about 1700, if not before. Darren Waibenga of MCFN has noted that Beasley likely moved to the Heights because of the ready access to the furs that the Mississaugas would have brought in, and that the nearby Six Nations were also likely interested in trading. The Mississaugas had traditionally been residentially mobile and kept an annual round. Drawing on Donald Smith, John Triggs outlines the Mississaugas' annual cycle. In the winter, November to March, small bands went to family hunting and trapping territories in the interior at the headwaters of the Grand River. And Donald Smith notes, however, that Kahkewaquonaby's naming ceremony took place on Burlington Heights during the winter camp. Triggs has indicated that Mississaugas were probably at Burlington Heights in the late winter to early spring, based on faunal evidence, although some faunal indicators suggest at least periodic presence throughout the year. Wahbanosay's band returned from the headwaters to Burlington Heights to conduct maple sugaring. The trade post was visited after sugar bush activities. Following this, the spring fish run saw a base camp agglomeration, especially at the mouth of the Credit River. In early May, Wahbanosay's band moved back to Burlington Bay. Around the 1st of May was also the time of religious festivals, dances, and games. The women in the band planted corn when the maple leaves were the size of a red squirrel's foot. As described by Elizabeth Simcoe, there were many Mississaugas fishing from canoes on Burlington Bay and possibly Cootes Paradise in mid-June 1796. Later in the summer, maize and wild rice were harvested, and in the fall, the river mouths, particularly the mouth of the Credit, were returned to for the fall salmon run. Elizabeth Simcoe has noted that there was a park-like quality to Burlington Heights, with large oak trees and no understory. Given reference to this parkland, I wondered if perhaps the Mississaugas had been at work managing forests, either through cutting or controlled burning, and also asked Darren Wabenga about this. Darren wrote back, in terms of land being cleared at the Heights, I'm of the opinion that land was cleared by Iroquois people, either neutral or Seneca. As Mississaugas, we were not known for clearing large tracts of land and preferred to construct gardens near our wigwams on the river flats. Even if not through fire, I think it's worth considering that the park-like nature of Burlington Heights was a product of decades and maybe a century of Mississauga living and labor, and that management may have stretched back to their predecessors too. The RBG has also been conducting some controlled burns to maintain oak savanna in the area, although some of their plaques read like maintenance was natural, not cultural. Until the middle of the 19th century, the creeks that flowed into Cootes Paradise emptied through the Hendry Valley and around the northern tip of Burlington Heights into Burlington Bay. Spencer Creek, in particular, flowing through Dundas, was an important artery linking the early town to the shipping lanes of Lake Ontario and beyond. According to the RBG plaque at Bulls Point, Spencer Creek was in use by settlers boating to and from what's now Dundas by at least 1790. Rod Millard mentions the onerous journeys that Richard and Samuel Hatt took, loaded down with barrels of milled flour, floating down Spencer Creek and through Cootes Paradise. This route was formally deepened as early as 1804 by Richard Hatt and later dredged to become the Desjardins Canal, which officially opened in 1837. Richard Hatt and other early Dundas settlers were probably sailing, poling, or paddling right by the Mississaugas at Nursery as they rounded the Hendry Valley from Burlington Bay into Cootes Paradise. So I think we ought to recognize that while the Mississaugas had a relatively light footprint on the land, they would have been present at the time settlers were coming to the head of the lake, and would have been familiar faces until after the War of 1812-14, and certainly later around Credit Mission and Mohawk Village. The Mississaugas were neighbors of the earliest settlers for nearly 4 decades. Is it not lopsided that we mostly remember and even extol the Hesses, the Mordens, the Lands, the Beasleys, and the Hatts, amongst others, and yet mostly forget the Mississaugas as we allow ourselves to buy into the no one was here story? An 1813 British military map of Burlington Heights shows the Arboretum area near Nursery as thick wood. This is where the Mississaugas had been living or working, perhaps seasonally, at least until recent years, and maybe still in 1813. I've wondered why I can find no mapped Mississauga camps or settlements, and yet, as allies, the Mississaugas were active in the war. Despite the park-like Burlington Heights, this thick wood beyond, whether real or perceived, I take as both a metaphor for settler perceptions of the Mississaugas, and also the challenges of identifying their archaeological history today. This brings me back to the beginning, connecting the still scarce archaeological evidence to the also incomplete documentary evidence for the Mississaugas at the head of the lake. While Cootes Paradise may not have been rung by villages and may not have held dense populations, it was a known place for people over many millennia and a focus of Indigenous livelihoods over the past 1,500 years or so. Those displaced by the settlers in the early 1800s, those whose stories we can't easily read or see, but whose descendants live about a half an hour away, were the Mississaugas of Wahbanosay's band. Thank you.